Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining this live Tenant Farmers Association webinar, the future direction of farming policy. I'm Robert Martin. I'm the National Chair of the TFA, and tonight we will be talking to the DEFRA Minister of State for Food Security and Rural Affairs, Daniel Zeichner. While we're just waiting for everybody to join us this evening, I'd like to thank our sponsors this evening, who are Roy Thorne's solicitors. And Roy Thorne's have gladly agreed to support our TFA virtual events and knowledge sharing videos until March 25. For those who don't know who Roy Thorne's are, they're a national law firm steeped in agriculture, and they have 90 years experience, so they get the bigger picture. So whether it's succession application under the AHA or a new farm business tenancy or dispute with the landlord, Roy Thorne's are here to assist and advise. So before we get started this evening, I would like for us to look at some housekeeping rules. The webinar will be recorded tonight, so that if you miss any part of it or you want to re-watch it at a later date, once it's edited, you'll be able to do so on our YouTube channel. And if you just search for that at Tenant Farmers, you'll be able to look back on all our knowledge sharing teachings and also our previous webinars. Moving on to this evening's event, as I said, my name is Robert Martin and I'm the TFA National Chairman, and I will be your host for the next 30 minutes. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome our guest speaker, DEFRA Secretary of State for Food Security and Rural Affairs, Daniel Zeichner. So we'd like to welcome Daniel this evening, who initially will be speaking with George Dunn, our Chief Executive, to discuss future farm policy. Following this interview, we will host a live Q&A where those of you who have joined us live will be able to submit questions to the Minister and also to George. So if you put your questions in the box as we go through the presentation this evening, then we can pick that up when we come into the question and answers. Sadly, the Minister has to leave us bang on 8:15, so we'll focus the first 20 minutes question answers with him, and then the remaining time will be with George Dunn, our Chief Executive. Therefore, if you have any questions for the Minister specifically, ensure that you type them into the Q&A area found at the on the bottom part of the Zoom toolbar, and put them in as early as possible so that we can get to answer them straight away when we start the question and answers. So before we hear from tonight's guest speaker being interviewed by George Dunn, I would like to introduce our speakers for you. Daniel Zeichner is MP for Cambridge, and he was appointed Minister of State at the Department of Environment, Food and Affairs on Monday, the 8th of July. He was previously a Shadow Minister for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs from 2020 to 2024. Daniel is a lifelong environmentalist with a sustained interest in agriculture and food issues. His commitment to those areas led to his appointment as Minister of State. In 2021, as Shadow Minister, he led for the Labour Party in Parliament on the Agricultural Bill, and served on the committee scrutinising the Environment Bill. Daniel has also been a vocal advocate for stronger environmental protections, challenging the previous Conservative government targets on air and water quality in numerous debates on food security and broader environmental issues. Interviewing the Minister this evening will be our Chief Executive, George Dunn. And for those that who don't know, George has been the Chief Executive of the TFA for almost 28 years. Previously worked for MAF and in Whitehall and for the Country London Business Association at their head offices. George has represented the TFA on the Tenancy Reform Group, was a member of the Tenancy Working Group in England, and is also represented TFA Cymru with the Welsh Government on their Strategic Framework Partnership Group for Agriculture. More recently, has been invited to be a member of the Tenancy Working Group in Wales. Now we're all fully introduced, I would like to hand over to George for the first part of this evening's event. George and Minister, the floor is yours.
Robert, thank you so much for those introductions. And Minister, we are truly grateful to you for taking the time out of what will be, I know for you, a very busy schedule to address our members and to answer some questions. So we've decided to split this in two tonight. So I'm going to do a sort of Michael Parkinson style interview with you, if you will, for the first sort of 15, 20 minutes. And then we're going to ask our members who are online tonight to put some questions into the Q&A, which Robert, our National Chair, will take you through after that first 15 or 20 minutes. And I've had the privilege of working with you, Minister, since your time as an opposition spokesperson for the Labour Party when it was an opposition, and it's been really good to have that period of time with you both in opposition and now as a minister. And I think I said to you when you became a minister that it was probably a dream come true, but the nightmare started on the 8th of July. And I know you said it, you're a bit more positive than that, but here we go. So in terms of your role, so you recently held in DEFRA a roundtable meeting on mental health and well-being within the farming community. And I was privileged to be invited to take part in that session. Why did you think it was necessary to have such a roundtable meeting so early in your ministerial role? And what can DEFRA be doing to address the issues that you were concerned about?
Well, good evening, George, and good evening to everyone on the call. And look, I start by thanking you, first of all, setting up the call tonight. And also thank you for all the help and support and advice you gave me in those years of opposition. Mark, Robert's predecessor, was extremely helpful. And I think I said to you right at the beginning that there was a lot I needed to learn about the sector, and you've always been extraordinarily helpful and supportive in that. I have to say, I don't recollect thinking when I was appointed that I was heading straight into a nightmare, and I was extremely thrilled to be appointed to take on this job. It's a job I wanted, and it's a job I want to continue to do in government. But I was never under any illusion about the challenges we all face. And let me just start by saying I fully appreciate not only that this has been a difficult time for everybody, for reasons we'll probably go on to discuss, but before the government was elected, these have been trying times for everybody, whether it be weather, whether it be some of the trade issues. It's not been easy, and I fully understand that. And to some extent, in answer to your question, I suppose I've done rural policy in a way for 20, 30 years. I used to live in rural Norfolk and was a councillor. And I think we've known for a long, long time that farming is a lonely occupation sometimes. And I think it can be very hard for people. And I think in recent times, more recent times perhaps, we've all become more aware of the mental health challenges that everyone faces. But in the sector, I mean, the evidence, I'm afraid, is sad and is there for all to see. So I've attended a number of events over the last couple of years, RABI, Yellow Wellies and others, who are doing really, really brilliant work to try and help in that challenge. And I felt it was important that fairly early on, I signalled that as the minister, I was very aware of that responsibility. Now, obviously, on one level, our health services are there to help and support people. But I think it's true to say that many people in rural areas have told me that it's patchy, to put it mildly. And I think you've told me that quite a lot of your time, your staff are dealing with very difficult calls from members. So in essence, that's the answer to your question. And one of the questions I was asking, and I think it was a good session, was to look at how, as a government, we can work alongside the many excellent voluntary organisations that are doing really, really good work. And we have actually got some programmes the department funds. There's a particular stress, of course, around bovine TB, and the previous government set up, I think, a very good support system. And I was very happy to sign off the continuation of that only a few weeks ago, as well as funding other support mechanisms. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that there are people who probably, as we speak, are feeling stressed in a whole range of ways. And I think it's really important we do everything we can to try and help with that.
So Minister, just developing that a little bit. So as DEFRA, you will have lots of people through your agencies walking up farm drives and doing jobs, be that the Environment Agency or the Rural Payments Agency or Natural England or the Animal Plant and Health Agency. What message would you give to the staff of those agencies as they go on to farms about how they should react in the circumstances that they are, and what they should bring to their role to ensure they're not contributing to the mental health issues that farmers are facing?
Well, my experience of most people who do these jobs is they do them in a very professional way, and they try and do their best to do their job properly. Now, of course, there are a range of different roles there, but some of them are regulatory roles. Some of them are roles where you're not going to be necessarily pleased to see them. In some cases, I hope people are pleased to see them because they're in a supportive role. But always treat people respectfully and look out reading signs, in which case use to signpost people for the support that they might need. So clearly, everyone who's working, to do everything they can to support people. But let's be under no illusion, there will be times when, as I say, is going to be slightly anxious if there's someone checking or coming to interrogate what you're doing. That's a stressful situation, and I hope that our staff are sufficiently well trained. And that's just a good question that you asked: are they sufficiently well trained to make sure they can balance those differing roles? But let's also be honest, not all our people are trained as social workers, as support workers, and we've got to make sure we get that right balance.
Thank you, Minister. I think we lost a little bit of your answer there from an internet connection, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying. So thank you for that. So I mean, turning to a different topic altogether. So part of your role is to be the responsible minister for the tenanted sector of agriculture. What does good look like for you as a minister in government for the tenanted sector?
Really interesting question. What does good look like? But I mean, my understanding is about 30% of all a third of all farmland is tenanted, which I'm not sure that either the public or most people outside the sector probably have any idea of. So, I mean, the simple answer is the advantage I think that the tenancy system creates for us is it creates flexibility. It allows people to come into the sector in a way that they might not be able to, because we know the barriers to entry are absolutely huge on the grounds of cost. So I would say we would want to see a thriving rented sector. Now, you and I suspect we may well come on to this on another subject in a minute, have talked often about the very short term we've had with fixed business tenant farm business tenancies, and in opposition, I was very sympathetic to that point. So I'm mulling over what we can do about that, because I get, as you would exactly imagine, we hear different calls from different parts of the sector, and there's a balance to be struck somewhere between making sure that it's attractive for landlords to let. We want to make sure that they are incentivized to let, but equally we want to make sure that tenants have got sufficient length of tenure to actually steward that land appropriately. So certainly something I'm interested in looking at. In some ways, I almost throw it back at you, George. What would you think a good tenanted sector would look like?
Well, there you are. You become Michael Parkinson for a moment. So I think from our perspective, we would want to see a tenanted sector that is characterized by security. We'd want to see a tenanted sector that was characterized by good landlord-tenant relationships. And we'd want to see a tenanted sector that was well invested in by the landlord sector. And which is profitable and resilient. So that would be our 4 key principles for a thriving tenanted sector. So turning the tables back to you.
Very good. Yeah.
You've agreed to the appointment of a Tenant Farming Commissioner, who at least is going to be looking at one of the key issues I've raised there, which is relationships within the sector. What are your aspirations for the role of this commissioner, and what do you hope will be achieved by their appointment?
Well, I mean, I was very impressed by the work that Baroness Rock and the review did over a number of years. They'd taken had a lot of conversations with her and her team, and we looked very closely at the long list of recommendations that she and her team made. And credit to the previous government, quite a few of them were introduced. This was one which I always felt they were slightly more nervous about, and although by the end of their term they had, I think, committed to it, it was still a bit vague, and I was pretty convinced that we should do it. So we did announce it. In fact, at Hexham, I think I name checked Robert at the event, and I think it's been broadly welcomed. So what we're looking for is the things to some extent that you just referenced, because I would never want to overstate the problems, because there are lots of landlord-tenant relationships which clearly work well. But I think the reports that we got back from the Rock Review, plus what I hear from going around talking to people, suggests that it's that balance of power isn't always easy, and that a commissioner could provide that extra help, which I hope will incentivize people to behave properly. I don't see it necessarily as being where you immediately go to. What we want is good relationships, but that's a way of trying to incentivize that and then trying to resolve problems when they do arise. I think I'm right in saying that Scotland, the experience seems to have been positive, which is part of the reason I was keen to go ahead. We've got the code of practice, so it's about trying to make sure that people behave properly. But I suppose what I've heard, is particularly some of the conversations with land agents and so on, is I'm often assured, oh, it's all fine, it's not a problem. And then I talk to other people, I say, well, that's not how it feels to them. So I think we're charting out new territory here. I don't think it's necessarily a finished piece of work, but I genuinely hope that it will lead to improvement. And obviously we're very open to people's experiences, to hearing how it does go. We're moving, I think, to an appointment in the new year, and we should have it in place in the next few months. So I'm hopeful, and I hope you're hopeful.
Yeah, thanks for that. We were delighted that you made that decision to crack on with that appointment, and we're looking forward to working with whoever it is finds themselves in that position. So pushing things out a little bit more widely, and I know you will say probably this is a matter for the Treasury, but we are obviously hearing from our members on a almost daily basis that there's a lot of anger out there about the way in which the budget has played out for agricultural businesses, and I even spoke to one member who told me in no uncertain terms that we shouldn't be giving a platform to a government minister, and that he would show his disquiet by refusing to attend tonight's session, which is clearly, his way of disputing what we've done. But do you understand the anger that's out there, and what can you say to people within the farming community tonight who are feeling quite upset?
Well, I'm very sorry that your member feels that they don't want to participate as a consequence. I would always urge people to maintain the dialogue. Look, the budget. Let me take a step back slightly on this. The incoming government, we did inherit a very difficult position. I mean, I can say this with genuine conviction, because frankly, the financial state at DEFRA in my department was also much more challenging than we had imagined. Now, you can say, well, maybe we should have known that. But frankly, from opposition, you only know a certain amount. And I don't blame the previous administration for what they did, in the sense that quite clearly they were up against it politically. They were, coming close to an election. And what you do in that situation, you try and do the best you can. And I have to say, they spent a lot of the money. Now, that doesn't come as a huge surprise, but that is a problem for the incoming administration. Now, you can argue about whether this is right or wrong, but that's part of the political cycle. We're a democracy. We have elections. Came at an unusual time, I think it's fair to say, and that's created a whole range of problems for us. We made a set of promises to the British people in terms of taxation. Again, you can debate whether they were right or wrong, but we did. And we had, quite rightly, had to stick to them. So the Chancellor did have a big problem to resolve. Now, I quite understand no one ever wants to pay more tax. Of course we don't. No one wants to pay more tax. But there are a range of on policy terms, reasons why changing APR, in my view and the view of the government, does have some potential benefits. Now, we've all known about the people coming in from outside farming, buying up land for tax purposes. I've heard it virtually everywhere I've gone around the country. Now, again, you can debate whether this is the right way to do it, but that is part of the reason for doing it. The other thing, which, and again, you and I have talked about this a lot, George, is getting that generational change into farming. Again, I've lost count of the number of conversations I've had with people who've told me that Dad's still farming and he'll go on farming forever. And that's not an ideal situation. And that was an unintended consequence, I would say, of the previous system. So there were some policy reasons for doing it, but let me be completely frank with you as well. There's a financial reason. Chancellor needed to raise money. Now, there's been a protracted argument about who this is going to affect. And the stated aim was to protect the smaller family farms. Now, I quite understand that organisations like yourselves, CLA, NFU, dispute that. And I don't think there's much point in re-rehearsing that argument tonight. All I would say is that I do think it's very complicated. I'm not a tax expert. I've had Treasury officials alongside me. You and I have sat with some of them. Part of the problem is that farms are much more complicated than just very simple, as you will well know. There are many different ownership structures, many sizes, levels of debt. So it's actually really hard to talk about the typical average farm. And all we've got in terms of real hard evidence is the number of estates claims that have been made for APR. And on the basis of that has led us to conclude the numbers that we've come to per year. Now, it's very different from the conclusions that others have come to. What I'd finally say is that actually this is not being implemented now. It's will be in the finance bill next year. And the way Parliament works is that will go through legislation the normal way, be opportunity for full impact assessment or potential for discussion in Parliament and so on and so forth. But I do understand why people are concerned, because certainly the debate around it has obviously been very passionate, and some of the claims that have been made about the effect it will have quite understand. People feel very, very worried about that. But my point would be, please look back at the evidence we've got at the moment of the effect it will have. But what it's also done is generated a huge range of ideas about how the issues which I've already raised might be addressed. And obviously, we're listening, looking closely at those ideas. But in the end, it is a decision not for me, it is a Treasury decision for the Chancellor.
Well, I think at that point I'm going to have to intervene, because I'm acutely aware of the clock, and I don't want you to be able to escape our clutches without answering questions from our members tonight. And we've had a huge amount of questions come in on the live chat, and we've quite a few that have come in also in advance of tonight's webinar as well. So I'll kick off with the first one that came in this morning. One of the wholly unexpected outcomes from the budget was a sharp decrease in the D-linked payments announced within the budget. Tenant farmers who have been preparing their forward budgets, who have had rent negotiations that will affix their rents for the next 3 years, feeling particularly aggrieved about that change. What would you say to tenant farmers who are looking at a serious hole in their immediate cash flow?
Well, I don't think it was actually necessarily a result of the budget. One of the things that I was very surprised about when we were first briefed when we took over was that we've been led to believe, or in fact I think it's been widely understood, that the numbers of people applying for the SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, were actually relatively low. What we saw with SFI 24, which is a much more generous set of offers, was a huge surge in the numbers of people applying. So we went from a position where the SFI budget was looking like it was going to be underspent, which had been one of the problems the previous government encountered, to suddenly like a rather dramatic overspend. So the choice that I was faced with in the summer was whether to effectively halt the transition to public money for public goods, which has been the underpinning theme of the move away from the Common Agricultural Policy, or not. And my decision was, I felt that we'd all been pretty clear, and one of the promises I'd made ahead of the election was that we weren't going to overturn this agricultural transition. It seemed to me the sensible thing to do in that situation was to celebrate the fact that more people were making that switch, more applications were coming in, and being able to fund them. But the only way I could fund it was by moving money from basic payments. So that was the choice. Basically, the same amount of money overall, with the question of where it's going. And of course, the basic payments system, I think I can pretty reasonably say was widely discredited in the sense that the money disproportionately went to larger farms, and what we wanted to do was target it on those who were keen to sign up for the environmental improvements that we all know need to be made. So that's the reason for doing it. But the point underlying it, which you're making, is a really important one, that I quite appreciate that people who suddenly find their basic payments falling off are faced with a real challenge and a real problem. And that is the reason we were so determined in the spending review to make sure that the overall budget was protected. We did get that £5 billion for the 2 years, which is allowing us to carry on making those payments through the environmental land management schemes, which will be the future. So I appreciate that for some people that's difficult. I think one of my criticisms of the previous government is they were never very clear that it wasn't just a straight, this is what you used to get and you'll just get the same amount of money for doing something different. That was never the way it was going to work. Frankly, it was always going to be about making sure that there were environmental options for people to buy into. And that's a struggle we're still dealing with, to make sure that we can distribute that money in a fair way.
No, I understand that, but it's, the fact is that the budgets were set on farm for the payments to come. They've disappeared off the edge of a cliff without a parachute, and then they've had to jump into the capital grants to try to balance up some of their cash flows. I'll just move on to another question here. I've now been waiting 4 months for my SFI 24 to be agreed. I still do not have a start date, and this is not good enough. When will you introduce a minimum service level in the RPA in preparing these agreements? Will you allow agreements to be backdated with such delays? And will you introduce complaints, appeals, compensation process for poor service?
Well, to some extent, it feeds into my previous point, and I think this is a bigger discussion we're going to have right across the sector, because the basic payment system was a very straightforward, simple one, where it's area-based payments. If you had the area, you got the money. We're now moving to a completely different system, where basically you apply, and you may or may not get money for what you're applying for, because it's not an unlimited pot. And one of my criticisms of the way the previous government left this system was it was pretty much on a first come, first served basis. So what happens when the money runs out? They had no answer to that, because to some extent they're in the luxurious position of not having made it sufficiently attractive for that to be a problem for them. But they left that, it was almost like a hospital pass for us to pick up. And that's what we're beginning to deal with now. So to some extent, yes, there are administrative issues which the RPA have historically struggled with, and I quite understand that. But this is going to go on being an issue. We've got to decide how we distribute these resources in a fair way. And at the moment, we still don't have an answer to that, because that's not how the systems were set up. That's what I'm increasingly looking at and asking. But actually, we need to have a discussion with the sector, because there's nothing at the moment to stop a few claimants taking a large amount of the resources if they can demonstrate that they're generating the environmental benefits. Now, I don't think that's fair. I think we need to make sure that it is distributed in a reasonable way, both geographically, by sector, and so on. But that's a different approach to the one that the previous government designed, and frankly, they didn't really design a system that was that allowed us to do that. That's what we're trying to do now.
No, I hear you saying, I suppose following on from that, we have a question here. Can we please leave the CS mid-tier in January the 1st and join your new schemes? The RPA can't help. Our mental health is suffering due to the lack of leadership when we're trying to do the right thing.
Well, again, look, I have a lot of sympathy with that point. What we've got is a real complexity of schemes here. We've got old style legacy schemes. We've got the old countryside stewardship schemes. We've got the new higher level countryside stewardship schemes. And of course, the complexity is that some of these, quite rightly, run for a number of years. And then depending upon, again, historically, when they come to an end, you get a sudden rush of these renewals. And of course, some of them do rely on checking by Natural England, and there is an issue around the resources to do that sometimes. So I fully appreciate why people are concerned. What we're trying to do is, and I think we will see in the early part of next year, some new options coming along to help people allow transfer from one to the other. But there's also a wider, bigger point here, really, which is that for far too many people, they are far too dependent on these schemes, I would say. And it's a point the Secretary of State made in the Commons chamber this morning. One of the things that's come out of the whole discussion around APR is the really very low levels of returns that people are getting from farm businesses. And in fact, we know that almost 2/3 of farm businesses are barely viable and relying heavily on these kind of state interventions. This is a really big long-term running question about how you get a fairer distribution of resources within the food supply chain. But frankly, if you're only getting a 0.5% return on capital, that is not a business proposition that stacks up for the long term. So I've got to be honest here. The change from public money for public goods is about buying public goods. It's not about farm support. Farm support comes alongside that, but we've got to get farming onto a much more business-like level so that people aren't so dependent in this kind of way as they are at the moment on these kind of schemes, because that's the old CAP-based system. We're moving to something different.
No, I take that on board, and I don't believe there's anybody out there who's farming today wants to be dependent on a scheme. They would like to get the true price from the consumer, so that you don't see many electricians or plumbers saying, "Well, this is the price they're going to be, and then I'll get a top off the government for the rest." And I think we do a disservice to the farmer sector if we believe that the farmers wish to do that. George, do you want to come in at this point, please?
Robert, just to make a really quick point for the Minister to take away, so I'm not expecting a response from the Minister right away, but right the way back from when we had the early discussions after the Brexit vote, the idea was that we would create flexible schemes that people could come into, add to, change and ensure that they would always be in a position to have the best scheme for their farm and be rewarded in the best way that they can for what they were doing for the environment, for animal welfare, for clean water and clean air, which many of our members, all of our members would be keen to do. And I think what we found is that the schemes haven't been as flexible as they were promised. People haven't been able to switch. People haven't been able to build on where they were previously. And that's the frustration. People were ready for the sorts of new schemes that they could build on. And the system appears to be, frankly, impossible to deliver what people were promised. And they feel let down. I think that's the problem.
George, I think that's a very, very fair point. And you won't be surprised here I was having exactly this discussion with officials today. Because the problems are, as I've been trying to explain them, that we will always have a limited amount of money. You can argue about how much it should be, but there will always be limits. So you've got to get that balance right between it being sufficiently attractive to people, which I think was the problem initially, that people weren't coming in. But then suddenly, if it becomes too attractive, you've suddenly got that problem. How do you manage it? Now, the question I've been asking, and I think it's a reasonable one, is, well, surely we shouldn't forever be in a position where people are coming into schemes. We ought to get to a point. We've got 67,000 people, I'm told, 67,000 farms in one sort of scheme or another, which probably means we're getting to the point where most of the people who are going to come over from basic payments are almost all in a scheme of one sort or another. But your point is well made, that they're not necessarily in the right one, and they haven't necessarily got the right mix for their farm. So what we need to do, exactly as you say, make it easier for people to amend the schemes, to particularly as we learn from experience. I mean, this is where I'm slightly torn, because there's a part of me that has always wanted hankered after a simpler approach. But the trouble with a simple approach was, in a way, that's what we used to have before, an area-based approach. But if you want a more sophisticated approach, it is then more complicated. I've been persuaded that actually having and I've described it sometimes as, having many, many levers to pull. But at the moment, it is still not set up in the right way to allow us to use that sophisticated machine to work properly. Now, again, I don't criticise the previous administration for this. I think it was an ambitious thing that was attempted, and it was done co-designed with the sector. I think there is a problem still around the administration of these schemes and having the correct computer systems which allow stuff to happen quickly. And that point was made earlier in the earlier question about the levels of service. Quite clearly, if people are waiting long periods of time and they're not getting the communication, that's not acceptable. If I ask myself the question, can we get this misfiring machine to work well enough in a few years' time? I'm absolutely determined we do, but I quite understand that in the meantime, this is really hard for people. So we're trying to get this right balance. And if it doesn't work, I've got, the wider public will ask, well, what are we getting for this? Are we getting the environmental benefits we've been promised? And we've also got to better demonstrate that to justify to the public that it should be £5 billion being spent on it, because those questions will inevitably be asked.
That's why I'm very acutely aware of time as well, and we have a lot of questions coming on the live chat as well.
Sorry, I'll try and be quicker.
No, you're fine. It's just the fact you mentioned your computer system, but that's something that only you guys can do. So you need to kind of roll your sleeves up and get in there, because if people want to take part in these schemes and they can't get on with it, then the book stops somewhere. And people are only trying to mitigate the loss in the BPS by jumping into the scheme. So I don't think as a government you can expect to be surprised when people jump into the schemes when the BPS disappears off the edge of a cliff without a parachute. But I'll move on quickly here. Can you say something or anything about the future of the productivity schemes? Suspending them without notice has left a lot of farm businesses having to plan or replan investment on farm, or even question whether they can invest.
Which schemes are we talking about here in particular?
Well, if you look at the fact you've stopped your capital grants now until next year, a lot of that was planned. So And people have done that because they've lost the BPS there, and they've jumped into those schemes. So we can't be expected to think, well, you were surprised that was going to happen if that was the case.
Well, look, I mean, I can only make the same point. These are fixed pots of money, and actually, we've had. I think got some notes somewhere. We had huge interest in these schemes this year. I think far more in just a couple of months than in the whole of last year. And the same thing applies. Basically, they've been used up. You know, the money has been spent. And that, again, is the same problem I keep coming back to, is how we apportion the money that we've got. So I'm afraid that we didn't inherit a system which allowed us to do this in the way that people might quite like. So, but there are, I mean, some of the other ones, the woodland tree health, the capital grant and management plans, protection and infrastructure grants, all of those remain open at the moment. They're not necessarily things that people are looking for. So this is the trouble. We've got a plethora of schemes. What we've got to do is try and match them to the demand. But of course, if you do get a scheme which is suddenly hugely oversubscribed, you basically you run out of money in a year. So
I hear you that, and people have gone into the schemes because they knew the basic payment scheme was disappearing, and so it can't be a surprise to government that they're going to do that. I'll come on to another point with a question I've received this morning as well. Insofar as the government has endorsed the ROC review, how can we be reassured the government won't act contrary to that policy and disenfranchise tenant farmers or make decisions which are prejudicial to tenant farmers? For example, in the case of solar farm applications on tenanted farms, it must not be about taking difficult decisions in order to strike the balance to meet climate goals, as there are thousands of applications of solar farms on land which doesn't involve the tenant farmers. Allow the owner-occupiers to benefit, but ensure that the tenant farmers are protected and enabled to continue running their farm businesses.
Right, it's quite a lot in there as well.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Look, I mean, on the solar issues, I mean, again, I understand why this has been very controversial in a number of places, but one of the biggest promises that the new government made was to move us away from reliance on fossil fuels and particularly, obviously, as we saw with Putin, the sudden huge price spikes that caused so many problems, not just for domestic consumers, but obviously for farmers and other commercial users. So we're absolutely committed to this movement towards renewable schemes, which will include obviously wind. I'm responsible for the offshore wind issues, where it's equally complicated and difficult. But onshore, we absolutely are going to be moving to solar and wind. And I genuinely believe that will be in the interest of everybody. But we've then got to decide where these things should go. At the moment, the planning system isn't particularly well suited to making strategic decisions. That's why we will be introducing a proper land use framework. The previous government, again, talked about it, but didn't actually manage to do it. We'll be launching a full consultation early in the new year. And that's a really important discussion that we all have. And part of that must be, from the point of view of you as tenant farmers, is how that fits into this wider discussion about where we put these things. Because clearly, as the Minister for Food Security, I want to make sure that the best agricultural land is going to be used for food production. And at the moment, I'm afraid, as I say, the system doesn't always allow us to make these really quite complicated decisions and trade-offs in a rational way. So I understand the difficulties that people are facing, but I'm not going to step back from a commitment that we made to the electorate to make that energy transformation. We think it's really, really important.
No, I understand that, but often solar is determined by the grid connection, not necessarily where it needs to be, and that's something that the EU government of not just putting all the solar where the connection is, and it might not be the right place to have it. But that's Yeah, exactly. And so
which is why we need a more rational way of making those decisions.
And that's back to you guys of getting on with it and making that work.
We will try and do it. But I mean, again, there's a dilemma, isn't there? Because we're trying to get the balance between having a proper consultation, proper discussion, but in the end, decisions also have to be made. And one of the things, I think, the frustrations that lots of people in the countryside feel is the planning system does just not allow anything to happen in a remotely sensible time frame. So again, I make no apologies for trying to improve that, and that also ought to provide opportunities for people as well.
I think we can have a full night on planning, and we might have to get you back for that yet, actually.
You may get a colleague of mine on that, I have to say.
Well, possibly so. And say, I think if we move on to our another question we have here, we know how many excellent young people we have who have the energy, enthusiasm, and skills to take our industry forward in a really exciting way. But how can you reassure them that they will be properly rewarded and their expertise and commitment valued by government?
Well, that's a brilliant question. It's probably the most important one, really. We've got to get a generational change, in my view. Absolutely right. I keep coming across people who are really keen, enthusiastic, but it's really hard to get into farming. And obviously, tenancies is one route. Obviously, traditionally, county farms have been a route, but we all know the pressures that they are under. I mean, my own county of Cambridgeshire is perhaps still one of the best examples, and we see some brilliant examples of what people can do on county farms in Cambridgeshire. But I suppose, and I may have to leave you on this point because I literally got to run out of the room in a minute.
Yeah, we know.
Is to say, look, the one thing we know for sure is while we've got human beings, we're going to need to be fed. That's why we are absolutely going to need farmers. You know, so there's no doubt about this. No government can do it without farmers. So we absolutely want to make sure we can create the right framework to allow farming to prosper. And there will be debates about how best you achieve that. But my commitment is absolute to this. I'm the minister responsible for feeding this country, and I can't do it. I can only do it with you. And that's the reason I'm on this call tonight, to try and work with you. And my promise to you is, as I've said to George right from the beginning, is I will always listen closely. We won't always agree on everything, but we'll try and do it in an informed way. And I appreciate that may not be how it's felt over the last month or two, but I hope you've heard some account from me tonight of what it is we're trying to achieve. We want to get this transition to a farming system that is economically rational and viable, but actually also manages to achieve the essential environmental changes we know are needed to keep us being able to farm. We've got to deal with some of the climate and nature issues, but otherwise we'll be destroying the very fabric of the natural world that we rely on to produce our food. So it's a big task. It's probably one of the biggest tasks in government. It's the most exciting job there is, which is why I'm thrilled to be doing it. But I say I need to do it with you and with your help.
Well, I think on that point, I'd like to thank you, Minister, for taking time to speak with us this evening. And we know that there's a huge amount of questions that I haven't got through tonight to make another direct commitment with you for another evening.
I'm sure we can. I'm sure we can.
I believe we can. And so thank you for fitting us into the schedule, and we wish you a happy Christmas and good night.
Happy Christmas to you. Thank you for all the hard work that you do. Take care. Cheers.
Absolutely. Thank you now. Good night. Right, George, there we go. We've heard from the Minister, and how do you think the Minister responded to our questions this evening?
Well, that's a good point, Robert. I mean, obviously, I know we had at least one member who suggested that it was wrong for us to give a government minister a platform tonight, but I always think it's good for ministers to experience the cut and thrust of Q&A in this sort of environment, and it was really good that we we're able to put at least some of the questions from our members tonight to him on a live basis. Now, I mean, look, we've got to understand that he is a loyal member of His Majesty's government, and whatever he says in the House and whatever he says publicly and on events like this will be coloured by that desire to have collective responsibility. But I think what I gained from tonight's answers was, firstly, he's clearly frustrated. He's not entirely happy with where things are at the moment. And you can tell that from his answers around wanting to see the systems improve, understanding that there is a limited pot of money within which to do things, looking for the flexibility of those schemes that we were talking about earlier, that one of our members tonight raised about the ability to jump between schemes. And on the budget issues, and again, obviously, this is not a decision for DEFRA, it's a decision for the Treasury, but he made a really interesting statement at the end of one of the questions I asked him about the budget. He said something along the lines of, but at least it's created an opportunity for some good ideas to be brought forward, and those ideas are being considered and we are looking at them. So to me, that says the door is not closed to some of the decisions that were made in the budget. And whilst I don't think for one moment we're going to see a U-turn in what the government has announced in relation to some of the measures within the budget, at least I get the idea from what the Minister said tonight was that consideration is being given to looking at how the decisions could be finessed. So I think it's always good for members and others to see a minister under a questioning environment. Yes, we've got to appreciate that he will be speaking from a government brief, but I think he did really well to at least give us an idea that there is a long way to go yet before you'll be satisfied with where things have landed.
No, you're right there, and I know that the meetings that you and I have had with government over the last number of months, either pre-budget, after the budget, or on any other days through, as long as government are talking, there's hope. And I think as long as we can keep talking, and I think there's things that we know we can't change, but as you say, if we can finesse the policy and get the little wins there, and hopefully try to get them over the line, then we can chip away at some of the requirements that our members are looking for. Do you think you could talk us through what the TFA is asking for following the autumn budget?
Yes, Robert, I'll be pleased to give you a bit of a heads up, and I can see there's a question from in the live chat about why can't the TFA, CLA, the CAV, which is the agricultural valuers in the NFU, talk frankly and sensibly with DEFRA to help Daniel and not have the Treasury cutting us all out? Well, I think I can assure who asked that question that we are talking frankly to Daniel, and actually we are talking frankly to Treasury officials, and we are talking frankly to Treasury ministers as well. And Daniel has been particularly helpful in brokering some of those discussions with Treasury, whilst, as I say, being incredibly loyal to the government line, but allowing us the opportunity to have those conversations with the Treasury. So what are we asking for? So we're asking for a number of things. So firstly, we are saying that the thresholds need to be looked at. The £1 million is completely insufficient to deal with most family farms in terms of the business assets that they've got, not just land, but machinery, livestock, crops in store, all of the capital items. So we're asking for the thresholds to be looked at. We're also asking for any increased threshold to be automatically transferable to spouses and civil partners on death, in the same way as the personal zero rate ban for inheritance tax is transferable, and rather than the spouses or civil partners having to own some of the assets in order to get access to that APR, BPR threshold. The third thing that we're saying is that for those individuals who have an owned dwelling on a farm, and obviously many tenant farmers are occupying houses that are provided by their landlords, but where you do have an owned dwelling, There is much being talked about in respect of the residents' nil rate ban for inheritance tax, but that begins to disappear as you get over a £2 million value for the estate in death. So that will rapidly disappear. I think it disappears completely after about £2.7 million of value. So that needs to be looked at in terms of making sure that it's still available for individuals at that higher threshold that we're talking about. Next, we are suggesting that people who are of a certain age should be able to pass down their assets to the next generation without having to survive the requisite 7 years. So we've got an awful lot of people who have followed the tax advice up until the 30th of October, which was effectively, as farmers, to die with your boots on. So you got access to the agricultural property relief. But people who have taken that advice are now finding themselves worried and vulnerable about the ability for them to pass down assets and live the requisite 7 years. So we're suggesting that there should be a shorter period for them to qualify for those potentially exempt transfers to save them on tax. And then finally, we are also saying, look, for our sector, the tenanted sector, we have many private estates. It doesn't matter where you set the threshold, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, or whatever. Those private estates are going to have estates that are valued far in excess of the sorts of threshold that we are likely to see brought in. So what we're saying is that we need landlords who are letting land to tenant farmers on long-term agreements, and by that we mean 10-year plus FBT agreements without scheduled break clauses. They should have access to 100% relief from inheritance tax because they're offering opportunities for people to build resilient businesses. Where they're letting on shorter periods, they should be hitting the full tax, the full inheritance tax. And I think from the answers that the Minister gave us tonight, I think he is sensitive and willing to be supportive of that type of change. And you know, obviously no concessions have been given, no offers have been made, but providing some security for people who've got 10-year agreements and giving landlords 100% relief in return for that would, in my view, be a really good way to resolve matters. But in terms of the long term, whilst understanding why the government did what it did, it wanted to stop wealthy individuals from being able to hide their wealth from tax by buying agricultural land. Now, we're not against that as a principle of policy, but they've gone about it entirely the wrong way. So we would suggest that they need to look at the capital gains tax, business assets, rollover relief, where individuals can make money in one part of the economy, roll over into buying land, not pay tax, and then get access to inheritance tax relief.
Yeah.
And the government have, in a sense, made it worse by increasing the rate of capital gains tax and by removing pensions from the zero rate ban for inheritance tax, because that encourages new money still to avoid capital gains tax and then to get a half rate inheritance tax. What's not to like if you've got new money? But it really hits the old money owners of land, many of whom are the landlords of our members. So, sorry, that was quite a long answer, Robert. But some immediate things we want the government to look at, and we've got some long-term things that we want the government to look at. And what we're really saying is, let's have a consultation on these technical issues. They're already planning one for January on trusts.
Yeah.
Let's expand it out to some wider issues that we can have a proper look at these things. So that's in a nutshell what we're lobbying for.
Well, as long as I've been a member of the TFA has been ahead of the curve asking for this exemption, and it's coming to its own now as a solution to the long-let tenant sector. And I'm very, very pleased to be part of the TFA at this point. I suppose as time is moving on here, we mentioned a little bit about the Tenant Farming Commissioner. What do you believe are the TFA's priorities for the Tenant Farming Commissioner?
Yeah, so I actually what I would say up front, Robert, is that we haven't got a pig farming commissioner, we haven't got a dairy farming commissioner, we haven't got a sheep farming commissioner. We've got a tenant farming commissioner, which to me says that this government thinks that the tenanted sector of agriculture is really important, because we have this Tenant Farming Commissioner now being appointed. So I'm really pleased that the government has recognised the need to have such a commissioner. Obviously, the main job of the commissioner is to look at the code of practice into landlord-tenant relationships and to look at breaches of that code and to hear complaints from people who think there's been a breach and to try and help resolve those issues. The commissioner will also have a brief to look at the way in which we currently resolve disputes within the tenanted sector. Mainly arbitration is the way that we resolve disputes when we can't agree, but that's become a really expensive. I was talking to a member today who, even before getting to a hearing, they've already spent £30,000 on preparing for a hearing, which is just ridiculous when you consider the profitability of the sector. You know, arbitrations costing 50, 60, 70, £100,000 are totally ridiculous. So we need to find a better way to resolve disputes, and the commissioner's got to have a role there too. But we also want the commissioner to be government facing. So some of the issues we talked about tonight, be that planning or solar or budget or tax, the commissioner needs to have a government facing role where the government is aware of the implications, sometimes unintended implications of their policies in the wider environment as they play to the tenanted sector of agriculture. So we really hope that the commissioner will also play a vital role in that space.
Well, as ever, George, time has beaten us again, and I'm acutely aware of the number of questions that we haven't been able to ask tonight. But I've also had to thank you in some of the question answers about the ones we have answered as well. And so it's down to me to thank our guest speakers this evening, Daniel Zeichner, the DEFRA Minister, and our own Chief Executive, George Dunn, as well as our event sponsors, Roy Thorne Solicitors. And before I sign off this month's webinar, I'd like to let you know we have our next webinar into 2025, which is Wednesday, the 29th of January, from share farming to share partnerships, using different business models to establish and grow agricultural business. This event will explore various business models like share farming, share partnerships and joint ventures, learn how to establish and grow from Tom Rawson of Rawson Dairying and Rob Hitch from an accountants in my backyard in Carlisle from Dodd & Co. So don't miss this valuable introduction to the wider business model that can drive your success in agriculture. Make sure to register in advance via the link on the TFA website and secure your spot and be on time for this informative 1 hour long session. We hope that you found our webinar useful, and thank you for attending. Good night, and we wish you all a very Merry Christmas on behalf of the TFA.